does it matter? Does it matter whether everyone benefits from the state? Does it matter whether the property rights system benefits everyone? Or is it okay if the state comes along and it helps some people at the expense of others? Is it okay if the property rights system helps some people and hurts others? Does that matter? It's surprising that many philosophers in the world today cannot give a straight answer to that question. They obfuscate and give unclear, not quite certain answers to that question. Sometimes it's portrayed as a principle to justify society, and sometimes it's kind of shoved off to be a not very meaningless thing, just a hypothetical idea. It mattered to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine called it the first principle of civilization. He said, the first principle of civilization ought to have been, and ought still to be, that the condition of every person born into the world after the state of civilization commences ought not to be worse than if he had been born before that period. Nozick, recently, the late Robert Nozick also confirmed that it's meaningful. He said, Robert Nozick said, compensation would be due to those persons, if any, for whom the process of civilization was a net loss. Rex Martin, another contemporary philosopher, writes, a single, common, underlying idea of economic justice can be found in Locke, Adam Smith, in Marx, and in much recent contractarian theory. The arrangement of institutions requires, if it is to be just, that all contributors benefit, or at least that none are left to be worse off. Rex Martin is also not only very clear that he thinks it's important, but he sees this theme running through. But yet, we find people claiming it's true or being unclear whether it is true and needed or not true. David Gautier calls it the great theme of moral and political thinkers in the development era of capitalist society is the emergence of possessive individuals from their wanderings in the wilderness of the state of nature into the promised land of civil society. He is certainly claiming that civil society makes us better off than people in non-state societies. I call this requirement the Lockean Proviso, and I take that directly from the contractarian theorist David Gautier, who is a contemporary Hobbesian, and like him, I follow him in applying it, even though it's called the Lockean Proviso. And Locke stated it in one fairly explicit way in his chapter 5 of his second treatise on justice. Thomas Hobbes used very much the same principle as part of his contractarian justification of government. And what I take from Gautier is both of these philosophers, even though these are very different theories in other ways, they both have this principle in them. Both justify an institution partly on its fulfillment of a principle that prohibits bettering one's situation through interaction that worsens the situation of another. That's that principle, the Lockean Proviso. For us, this is Gautier writing. The proviso plays a wider and more basic role. We treat it as a general constraint by which we may move from a Hobbesian state of nature into the initial position for social interaction. So they're endorsing this claim that everyone's better off. There are really only two choices. Either we are a mutually advantageous society or we are a parasitic society. A mutually advantageous society where none are harmed and everyone's at least as well off, if not better off. It's a mutually advantageous society. Or a parasitic society is one in which some benefit from social arrangements and others are worse off than if those institutions have never been put in place. Okay, it matters. Nozick replies, at least some will admit that in fact it matters, Nozick being among them. But those will then quickly switch to, it's obviously true. Nozick, for example, writes, I believe that the free operation of the market system will not actually run afoul of the Lockheed Proviso. Here I make an empirical historical claim, as does someone who disagrees with this. So he is, he makes this empirical historical claim, and rather than giving any evidence to support this claim, he just says, well, somebody else who believes otherwise also makes an empirical historical claim, as if it is up to them to find the proof that his bold assertion is false. There are many theorists who, and then Gregory Kafka, a social contract theorist, calls the observation that this proviso was fulfilled the Hobbesian fact. He uses no argument whatsoever to conclude the need for a social agreement simply reflects a Hobbesian fact about the human condition, that the state and a high risk of insecurity and poverty are exclusive alternatives. But is it true? It's not a fact, it's a hypothesis. We have two things we're dealing with. We have a first best moral principle, the Lockheed Proviso, that the moral claim that if you're going to impose an institution on everyone against their will, that institution has to be mutually advantageous. You could call it the Lockheed Proviso or the mutual advantage proviso. That is a moral principle. But then there is the empirical claim that I call the Hobbesian hypothesis or the mutual advantage hypothesis, that everyone is in fact better off. And people who try to justify the state as it is today, and people who try to justify the property rights system as it is today, very often make reference to this empirical claim that everyone is better off than people were or would be if they lived in societies that didn't have a state government or that did not have the private property system. They make a strong claim, but they seldom defend it. The Hobbesian, and we call that claim the Hobbesian hypothesis. So we have a Lockheed Proviso and a Hobbesian hypothesis. Lockheed Proviso, moral principle. Hobbesian hypothesis, an empirical claim that the proviso is in fact fulfilled by the institution that the speaker is trying to justify. What is this hypothesis for? Samuel Pufendorf gave a great answer to this, very honest answer to this, not long after Hobbes wrote in the 1850s. Samuel Pufendorf wrote in 1672, the complaint of the masses could be met in no better way than by picturing in their eyes the state of nature. He's telling the lower classes to shut up. The state and or the property rights system, or both of them, are in your interest. And your complaints, you should shut up with your complaints because you should think about how bad the state of nature will be. Now, I'm going to argue in this book, the book called Prehistoric Myths. What we argue in this book is that this belief is a destructive myth. It is a myth that is used to authorize the poor treatment of both native peoples. You say, oh, they don't have these great institutions. We can go and colonize them and force them into our system. So it authorizes poor treatment of native peoples, but it also authorizes poor treatment of the lower class in our existing system. Oh, they say everything's not fair, but they gain so much by being part of our civil society with our great private property rights system that even the lowliest of them has no real complaint. The system is working for them as well as us. But what if it's wrong? Well, if it's wrong, we've got a serious problem. And Thomas Paine Thomas Paine was skeptical about this, and he used observation that this claim is false as a serious indictment of the world as it existed, and in an argument for a serious redistribution of property and power towards the least advantaged. He said, the life of an Indian is a continual holiday compared with the poor of Europe, an Indian and Native American. And the life of an Indian is as a continual holiday compared with the poor of Europe, and abject poverty compared to the rich. That is a statement that we have a parasitic society, that our society is benefiting the rich at the harm of the least well-off. But yet, he's one of the few who's actually questioned this. Even many of the people who want to redistribute power and privilege and property in our society have very often conceded this point. Say, well, yeah, everybody's better off than those poor naked savages, but still, we should distribute these wonderful benefits a little more fairly. So, in our book, we said that this lack of interest in evidence, there's a horrible lack of interest in evidence in this. When you look at the people who write on this issue, the people who base their justification on the property rights system and the state or one or the other, that base their argument for that system on this claim, that their lack of interest in putting evidence, if it is so true, it should be easy for you to provide evidence, but they rarely do. So we say in the book, philosophers and social scientists still routinely discuss prehistory as if it were the stuff of myth, passing on centuries old stories that change little or not at all as empirical researchers uncover evidence. Many philosophers pass on stories set in prehistory without clarifying whether they illustrate important empirical premises or whether they are pure metaphor. They seldom clarify what those premises might be or what the metaphor might stand for. That is a destructive myth. So myths aren't always a bad thing. Like a myth that's a myth about Adam and Eve that tells the lesson that we're all born innocent, and then we all grow up and learn right from wrong. And when we learn right from wrong, eventually, some of the time we will choose to do the wrong thing. And because of that, we need to seek some sort of forgiveness and restitution with our fellow humans. That's a very useful and very obviously true myth that we can all tell by looking at in our daily lives. A destructive version of this myth, well, we'll take it literally and say that snakes used to walk upright, and God is punishing people who live today for something two people did 5,000 years ago, and snakes are being punished because of what one snake did thousands of years ago. That doesn't make any sense, but you can make lots of destructive myths out of it. A destructive myth might be said, well, it was all Eve's fault. The problem in the Garden of Eden was that Adam listened to Eve. And what the Garden of Eden story shows is that man should never listen to women. That is a myth that illustrates the greater lie. The first story I told, when it was about loss of innocence, that is a myth that illustrates greater truth. This one illustrates the destructive myth, illustrates the greater lie, and makes it easier for mistreatment of some group. That's what we're arguing this claim of mutual advantage is. Many people will argue that it's not even an empirical claim at all. That it's not an empirical claim because it's just a thought experiment, whatever that means. The thought experiments are supposed to illustrate something true about the world. Well, what true thing is it supposed to illustrate? And in what sense is our society like a social contract, unless it is something we would all agree to because it all really did benefit us all relative to the alternative. So we argue throughout the book that different metaphorical interpretations of the social contract justification for the state without an empirically true, without an empirical claim that the state in fact does what they say it does, simply do not work. So the book argues that the Hobbesian hypothesis is an empirical claim. That is a claim about prehistory, or at least a claim that can be informed by prehistory. Because it is a claim about how people exist in societies with a private property rights system and or a sovereign state government. And there have been societies in history and prehistory that do not have either of those institutions. So if this claim is true, it is a claim that we can examine by comparing the lives of people in stateless environments without private property systems to the lives of the least advantaged people among us today, and verify the truth or falsity of this claim. And we also argue that it appears in all plausible justifications of property rights of the state, because otherwise, if these different versions of it that try to make a metaphor out of it, say, oh, we really don't need to say we achieve mutual advantage, to say we have a mutually advantageous social contract, that these really fall on either special pleading or implausible premises or self-contradiction. So we argue in the book that it's required for this, and that it has been presented now for 350 years without sufficient supporting evidence. The supporting evidence that people have offered, very often, people offer no supporting evidence whatsoever for it. And those who do usually offer just tiny little tidbits, a little observation here or there, not a thorough argument for, look, here's how people live, there's how people live, here's how people live under these institutions, there's how people live under these institutions. Look how much better our four are. We don't get arguments like that. It's presented with little or no evidence. And very often you get no evidence at all. You get people just presenting it as it's an obvious true fact. And the only thing that makes it seem obviously true is that so many people keep stating it. People have been stating it for 350 years or longer. People have been stating it over and over again. So it seems obviously true because so many people think it's true. But it's not even the kind of thing that could be obvious to the type of people who use it. The typical privileged person, whether a university professor, a politician, or a property owner, who tries to justify our modern institutions by saying this is obvious, that person probably knows very little about what it's like to be one of the poorest people in their own society. And they probably know even less about what is it like to be a native person in a non-state society without property rights, without private property rights. They know really nothing about either side of that comparison, but yet they portray it as obvious, which I believe stems from the colonial prejudice that goes back at least as far as Hobbes's day, maybe back as far as ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt, is the belief that civilized man is so much better off than the naked savage. That's just a prejudiced belief. We've been trying to rid ourselves of our prejudiced beliefs, but yet here we have one right in the middle of political philosophy, and we're still using it. But it's presented in a sloppy way. Are they making the claim, or are they not making the claim? And we will argue that it is empirically false. We show lots of evidence that this is false. At least some people in contemporary state societies with private property rights systems are worse off than people could expect to be in stateless societies with common property regimes. There's a lot of equivocation on this issue, we also argue, that people will say the hypothesis is true, but obviously, the hypothesis is needed, but obviously true. Or people will say, oh, the hypothesis is not needed at all. And this equivocation allows them to credit institutions, the property rights regime, the state, and all the things that go with them, with fulfilling this with actually making people better off. But then, by equivocating, then they can quickly go to denying the need to provide any evidence that what they just said is true. And it also allows them to evade admitting that the theory is partly applied. That is, it's not just a first best moral theory that relies only on moral principles and analysis. It also relies on empirical claims. The clarity issue is as important as the falsity claim. The book argues that it's really any statement of mutual advantage is only meaningful if it's empirical. And what we see here really is a power of an unnamed premise, that people really haven't named the Hobbesian hypothesis or the mutual advantage hypothesis. And it's kind of snuck back behind the reason. It's been it's been usually, not always, have been the skeptics like Payne, and Kropotkin and others. But by most people arguing on issues that are relevant to this, they will simply concede the obvious truth of this premise without examining. And it just kind of falls into the background and people don't think about it. So in the book, we have 5 chapters to show that political theorists really make this claim. Some of them state it explicitly, others use it to support their conclusions without being so clear about it, but it appears throughout private property theory and throughout social contract theory, going back to Thomas Hobbes. There are some exceptions to it. Rawls, who does not claim that he doesn't actually, strictly speaking, use the proviso. He uses something a little bit stronger, the difference principle. And he doesn't claim that the difference principle is in place now, but we should go on an empirical study to put the difference principle in place. So he's actually not, he's sort of a bystander on this issue. He doesn't say whether or not the proviso is fulfilled, and he asks people to fulfill this other principle, which has some relations to it. And he asks them to take an empirical claim on that. So even though I do criticize Rawls elsewhere in this book, Grant McCall and I have little to say negatively about Rawls. Then it has 3 chapters to examine the anthropological evidence and 1 chapter to explore its implications for property rights theory. Now, and one important thing that I need to say about this is that don't pigeonhole, when you're thinking about this book, don't pigeonhole what we're trying to do. A lot of people, we're making a particular criticism of 2 very big particular theories, but we're not getting into we're not just rerunning a bunch of other debates that we've had that run through political philosophy. We are not engaging in the question of a fact-value distinction. The question is not whether all philosophers should do implied theory instead of a priori pure theory. We're not saying that at all. We're not taking any position on how much people should use facts and people should use factual implied arguments or moral-only arguments. We're simply saying that these 2 theories are applied theories, and they use false empirical premises. It doesn't say anything about theories that don't use any empirical premises at all. We're rejecting, other people will accuse us, they might accuse us of rejecting the normative principles in these theories. The book doesn't question the normative premises in these theories at all. It questions the normative premise that it looks at as the Lockheed Proviso. It doesn't question and say whether the proviso is a good or bad premise. In fact, it tacitly endorses the Lockheed Proviso. Doesn't question it, but what it questions is the claim that the proviso has already been fulfilled. And also, people argue that we're getting into a debate about a historical method versus the a priori method. The historical method works for some things. The a priori method works for other things. The a priori method can work for a lot of things, but it cannot work for this empirical claim that is an empirical historical claim, as Nozick readily agrees. We're also not talking about the origin of the state. Social contract theory is not about the origin of the state, how it came about. What it is about is what are the alternatives to the state. And the idea of social contract theory is that there is an alternative to the state. It is a real possibility. That alternative is the state of nature, and the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And we're looking, well, what are the alternatives to the state, and is that it? We're also not telling philosophers they need to read more anthropology. If you make claims about anthropology, then you should read anthropology. If your theory is free from empirical claims that are best examined in anthropology, you don't need to read the anthropology of the political philosophy. And a lot of people will say, well, if you really understood this theory, then you'd realize that this is important. Well, it's either a parasitic society or a mutual advantage society. We've gone through, in the book, we go through many social contract theorists and many property rights theorists, and we find very few who will actually explicitly endorse the parasitic society. Some right libertarians will, some propertarians will endorse that, but social contract theories, you will not. It's really hard to find them. We'll just say, yeah, we can impose the state in a way that makes people worse off to the advantage of other people, and that's morally justifiable. It's really hard to find somebody that really wants to say that. And we go through a lot of them with textual reference. Also, people will say that, oh, you're defending Rousseau's romanticization of the noble savage. Well, Rousseau never mentioned the noble savage, but that is such a first of all, it's such a simplistic, unimaginative way to think that there are only two possible sides to a debate about the state of nature, and one was invented in the 1600s and the other one was invented in the 1700s, both by people who had really almost no knowledge of what we now call anthropology. And that these two frame the both sides, and you must, if you're attacking one, you must be defending the other. That is not true at all. The noble savage, in fact, is not even Rousseau's idea. It was something that an early sort of proto-anthropologist, John Crawford, in 1840s and 50s in Britain, decided that ethnography at the time was not racist enough. And he wanted to distract any even partly favorable accounts of indigenous people. And he did that by saying anybody who says anything favorable about Native people must be romanticizing the noble savage. And it's worked ever since then. Look at me. I'm in fact having to disclaim that I'm not romanticizing the noble savage 180 years later, whatever it is. I'm having to do that and having the risk of people won't take me serious because they're going to think I'm romanticizing the noble savage when I'm trying to look at what evidence we have. It's the term was created to be an oxymoron, and it was a noble is someone who has all the advantages of all the best of civil society. And a savage is someone who lacks it. So a noble savage is an oxymoron. And imagine what it would, what a chill it would put over if you were to write anything nice about Sweden, anything good about these Swedish institutions, if somebody would say, oh, you're romanticizing the polite Viking. Or if you were to write something good about the institutions of Ireland, that they would say, oh, you're romanticizing the sober Irishman. Or if you were to write something nice about Scottish people, they say, oh, you're romanticizing the generous Scots. For all these people failing to live up to our prejudice about them. You can argue that people do not live up to our prejudice about them without romanticizing them. Also, people will overinterpret what we're saying, even people who are otherwise very good at logic. When we say the claim that everyone is better off in state society is false, people will interpret that as saying, so you're saying everyone in state society is worse off. No, that is the opposite. The opposite of everyone is better off is everyone is worse off. The negation of everyone is worse off is at least some people are worse off. We're not saying everyone's worse off. I have read a book arguing that the average person is actually no better off. But we're arguing only that at least some people at the bottom are worse off, and that is enough to say we haven't fulfilled this proviso. People will also say that they will think that we're saying that the state and private property can't benefit people. No, we're not saying that. Just that as constituted, they do not. We need to fix them, and we discuss implications in the final chapter about that. About how to fix them. So we're not necessarily arguing for anarchy. And people will argue, well, can we really measure well-being? That's not our problem. The theories have taken on the burden of proof. They're saying it's obvious that we're all better off. It is enough for us to raise doubt and say, look, there's a lot of indications that not everyone's better off. That is enough to falsify these theories. All right, so that is believed. Okay, I've talked for 20 minutes. I have actually have 86 slides or more. I got, well, not, no, I have 50 to 80 slides I could go through. But I'm not going to do that because I got a little time for talking. I'll give you like a little bit of a preview. In chapter 3, we talk about Hobbes and talk about the essence of social contract theory and show all of these people who agree, yes, there are empirical claims in, these are big Hobbesians, Hobbes scholars, who all agree there's an empirical claim in Hobbes. In chapter 4, we talk about Locke, who is not always the most explicit guy, but he is more explicit that there's some kind of empirical claim here. Chapters 5 through 7, we go through this enormous amount of social contract and property rights theory from then to the present. We have textual evidence that all of these people, at one time or another, rely on what we're calling the Hobbesian hypothesis or the mutual advantage hypothesis. If you question whether any of these people actually endorses this principle, please, ask me. I'll give you I got the textual evidence right here. Now, there are a lot of bystanders. There are people who don't talk about, who talk about things related to this debate without questioning this principle. These are people like Gerald Dworkin, Michael Otsuka, John Rawls, Thomas Scanlon, Hillel Steiner, Philippe von Parijs, many others. They're not really involved in what we're saying here. And there have been a lot of skeptics. We talk about a lot of skeptics, I mentioned Paine, but also Thoreau, Henry George, people as early as Montesquieu, Marx and Engels, very skeptical about it. Peter Kropotkin is the only other person we know of to make a detailed empirical study of this issue. That was way back in 1902. And it wasn't even the primary, the primary subject of his work. It was, and that's the best study we know of. So I think it really needed to be updated. We got a lot of modern people as well. Then chapters 8 through 9, we talk about the empirical evidence. We can go about that if you want to talk about that in the discussion. In chapter 10, we talk about our overall assessment And we assess it on several grounds, whether it's solitary, poor, whether it's nasty and brutish, and we come up with an overall argument that in just about every measure, this proposition fails. We've set a very low bar to justify our property institutions, and then failed to jump over that bar, largely because we're never really interested in the bar. We were interested in an excuse to say everything's already fine. And then in chapter 11, we look at the implications of it. We can talk about that. All right, I've talked for 45 minutes, which is, I'm trying to present a whole book. It's hard enough to, present a paper in a short time and give people really good ideas. So it's even harder to get a book. You at least know what's in the book. Of course, I haven't discussed what our evidence is. So there's a lot there that isn't there, but I think I'll turn it over to the discussant and we can move on to discussion. All right, who's the discussant on this one?
It's me.
Okay.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, I need to.
As I asked, I'm asking people not to do PowerPoints anymore. Remember I asked that last week?
Yeah, I can do it without PowerPoints also.
That would be better. Because
yes, I can start right now.
In the discussion.
Yeah, I mean orally, without presentation, without the PowerPoints.
Correct.
Yes.
I'm asking you. Hopefully, I'm not going to do any PowerPoints either from here on out.
Okay. Firstly, I would like to give you some food for thought to readjust the concept of Horbasian hypothesis about the nature of about the state of nature. He thought that the state of nature is the world of everyone against everyone, and everyone is living under a sovereign governments who are better off than any of them would be outside of that authority. And the Professor Karl, some philosopher and the scholars mentioned by Professor Karl have already given their debates over the Horbasian hypothesis and the contractarian theory. But obviously, those philosophers' debates was not complete or solid enough because they might lack some empirical claims or normative statement. So Professor Karl checks whether the disadvantaged people are worse off under the state than in the smallest scale stateless society by giving some empirical claims in this paper. So enlightened by the comparison between these two kind of situations, I agree with the idea that the Horbasian hypothesis might make the disadvantaged people under the state worse off. For example, I would like to mention about the property. As we all know, Hobbes regard the property as liberties. The person with the right lacks obligations, while Locke made unowned things come to be owned as private property, and he regarded them as claims. Professor Karl defines empirical claims of the Horbasian hypothesis. Regards the Horbasian hypothesis as it is not fulfilling the Lockean Proviso, and the contemporary property rights system does not meet the standards that the social contract requires. So also, even the least advantaged people under the private property system are better off than they would be in a society with common lands. So if we want to make the Horbasian hypothesis realistic in policy, then we need to do a lot of effort to improve the life of disadvantaged people in order to let all people are better off than they could be in a stateless society. But there is critics. There might exist a situation which enlighten us that we cannot omit when the private property is not enough for everyone. If we avoid, so it brings about the question: how should we avoid social conflict if the private property is in scarcity? And how should we make all people, including the disadvantaged people, be better off under the state with private property system when we are trying to fulfilling the Lockheed Proviso? Then we move on to the second book, but I think Professor Karl hasn't mentioned a lot about the second book, The State of Nature, Prehistory, and the Myth-making. But I would like to complete my agreement with the idea that neither the state or...
Shana, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
We're not discussing the second book today.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
The book we're
thank
discussing.
you. Okay, so that's my criticism and agreement with your previous book. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Shana. So one thing that I didn't do in the presentation that I need to do here and now is to say that what does this have to do with universal basic income? This is very much a counterattack against one of the principal arguments used against any form of redistribution, including UBI. So it's got a broader aim than just defending UBI, but defending the redistribution of property in general. And one of the things that people do, and if you want to have greater redistribution of property and power, you have to defeat what Lord Shaftesbury was saying in 1672, and people still do now, that everyone benefits, that the complaints of the masses can be silenced in no better way than picturing in their eyes this bogeyman, this supposedly horrible state of nature that the upper class people of the world has supposedly disposed the benefits of all this on the rest of us, and we have no complaint. Well, we actually, here's some evidence that we do have a complaint. We got a big complaint. We have a big complaint, and and we've got a very good reason for redistribution. Our society is parasitic. Now we connect that, and that is really the main goal of the book, is to open the door for redistribution against this very common argument against it. A lot of people have argued and said, they simply conceded, okay, we already have mutual advantage, but here's why we should do even better. Well, we haven't already achieved mutual advantage. But then we go on to connect it. Why particularly basic income? Basic income is only mentioned once in this book, but on the very last page. The basic income is centrally important to the book and coming up, even though it's hardly mentioned. And then when you look at the kind of ways that we're worse off, it makes something like basic income a preferred alternative for how to address it. Because one thing that you find in stateless societies is people who don't have to take orders from other people. You have very often when you have hunter-gatherers who are nomadic and you go for here, go over there and join this group and join that group, you find an ethic where people don't tell each other what to do. If what you need is a bunch of people who are going to go out and hunt all day and then come back and share what they have, because not everybody's going to be successful. You need people to go out and come back. You can't really lord your power over them, because they could just go out and keep going and go join somebody else. So you get very much an ethic of people not telling each other what to do. We have a society where the only way you can survive is to go and take orders every day for 5 days a week for 40 or 50 years of your life from somebody with more power than you do. To redress these grievances, we need something like universal basic income. That's what we do in this first book. Mostly it's setting the stage for the other things that I do.
So in general, I think while the empirical point of view is quite important and a positive analysis is almost mandatory, I think it lacks the normative analysis. So what good would it be if we do a positive analysis and not provide a conclusion to that in the sense of a normative position or goal? And one of the three main things that I have, or three critics, 3 points that I want to raise up with a stateless society, at least. I think that would lead to a tragedy of the commons. And second, although that is also a phenomenon that also the state societies possess, is the free-riding behavior. And the third one is conflictuous situations. So I believe that these three things are somewhat quite important to our analysis. How would they share a common resource? We could basically see that with our shared environment, in which probably many people and companies or individuals pollute the air, so that we share the same environment. And I think a stateless society could also do that. The other thing is conflict. Conflict, I believe it could be regulated and provided that it would not happen if we could follow some rules. And those rules, while they might be to some extent natural, there's the state that could abstract society from dealing with this kind of behavior. And when I talk about conflict, I'm not only talking about conflictuous situations in distributing the goods or common resource, but I'm also talking about conflicts in regards to I saw the pictures with tribes. I'm talking about conflict from a generic point of view, in the sense that it could lead to two groups being in conflict with one another without having a certain set of rules. And the other thing that I want to criticize is I also saw that you wrote it down in your PowerPoint presentation, the Parasitic Society. And I'm up to a certain degree, I'm questioning the wording of it. So parasitic could be seen as a negative word in this case. Would there be a different kind of word that could possibly better explain that certain state? So this is my 2 cents in this case.
Okay. Sorry, I'm taking a note here. Okay, so we really want conversation among all, but since it's my work and he's questioning me, it's going to be a lot of somebody asks me a question, I respond. But what we found, you mentioned 3 things that can cause problems in stateless environments. That's how I'm understanding what you're saying. You talked about tragedy of the commons, getting into conflict, and free riding behavior. The tragedy of the commons is surprisingly well solved by the smallest scale stateless societies with the least with the least state authorities simply by underusing their resources. How they manage to do this is kind of surprising, and kind of a mystery to me, because they manage to habitually, you find nomadic hunting societies do not breed, tend not to breed to the point where they're just using up, where they're hunting out their society. And so there always seems to be abundant game. You find that even for people who live in deserts, which we would find, coming from here, we would think this is totally barren. They find they think of it very often as a giving environment where there's just a bunch of food out there, just need to go out and collect it. And they never seem to breed to the point where that doesn't happen. Now, and that's very often true also of semi-nomadic farmers, who use what we call swidden or slash and burn agriculture, where they chop down trees in an area, put them in a repile, burn them, and then the ashes from burning them makes for some fertilizer, and they plant the crops there for a few years until that soil gets used up. Then they go somewhere else in the woods and do it somewhere else, and they will often supplement that with hunting. These kind of groups usually also manage to avoid using up their resources, however, not all small-scale farming societies do. When these groups get crowded enough, then you get a really small agricultural area surrounded by enemies on all sides, and then you do get a lot of conflict. And that is part of the reason why the level of conflict in stateless societies is really all over the place. We have some where there's very little, if any, violence, and then some where there's very high violence. It seems to be well correlated to how packed they are. But the important point is to see that they did seem to find a way very often to avoid getting really tightly packed. But free riding, actually, that's handled surprisingly well. Well, first of all, the observed stateless societies, a lot of them will have a fairly high tolerance for free riding, but they avoid a lot of it by ridicule. They will always share their food with you, but if you don't contribute, they will often ridicule you. But if you can take the ridicule, you probably can get away with the free riding for a long time. There are many words for parasitic society, but the moral point, it's an extremely important moral point that our societies as they are currently constituted are harmful to the least advantaged and beneficial to the upper classes. This group that is taking advantage of that group. That's a parasitic relationship. You could call it exploitation, you could call it wanton harm, you could call it indifference. There's lots of words for it, but either way, it's going to have this moral connotation that parasitism does. Okay, Medha, your hand was up sometime ago.
I want to make 2 points, but they're connected, but I'll try to put it into words.
Sure.
First point, what I want to talk about is when they're financing universal basic income, wouldn't it require all the citizens to be moral or the majority to be moral, especially the people who are perhaps the richest in the country where UBI is being implemented? And for suppose countries like the US, where we need to bring about a law to implement UBI, and there is a lot of lobbying which goes on. So wouldn't the people who are already rich lobby against bringing about UBI? That's one thing. And then to bring about UBI, you need to have sort of a revolution, which I think marks sort of, if we see it in a modern contemporary sense, then Marx talks about revolution, which was supposed to come, and then you would need a sort of that kind of revolution to actually implement UBI in today's world.
Well, UBI, Okay, I'm hearing a slight echo. Let's see. I bet if I mute myself, that echo will go away. It's funny, I wasn't.
Muted.
Oh, no, and I mean, if I make my microphone as well as my speakers as well as my microphone, did that go away?
Yeah, it's gone now.
No, well, I can still hear it, but that's all right. Okay, it's very slight. Well, those questions, of course, are not to the heart of the book. That's to the very end about one idea for solution. So those questions we'll probably address through the rest of the seminar. So keep those in mind, but I will answer them now. So no, something like UBI doesn't require everyone to be moral. It requires enough people, a certain portion of the population, to become moral enough, a portion of the population that is large enough to take power, hopefully through non-democratic, through non-violent democratic means, to take power and create an institution that create an institutional setting and enough rules that give people a good incentive to comply if they might want to shirk on that duty otherwise. That's all it requires. That's a lot less than requiring everyone to be moral. Do you need a revolution to bring about UBI? Well, in some places and times, yes. But of course, in the Philippines in the 1980s, they needed a revolution just to bring around basic democracy, and they got it without violence. And since that revolution in the Philippines, there have been lots of other people power revolutions. It can happen, but it also, you mentioned the lobbying, which is very big in my country. That is a horrible, undemocratic institution that needs to be completely gotten rid of. And yes, I would say making our countries more democratic is as big a problem as UBI. As a matter of fact, just back to my work, when I began work, when I first heard about UBI on my 15th birthday in 1980, I wanted to work on this because I thought poverty was our biggest remaining problem. But now I see American militarism, and I see the power of corporations controlling our democracies, and the lack of real interest in true democracy in the world, and the environmental destruction of our planet. These are all as big as poverty. So maybe I'm not even working on the #1 problem anymore, but I'm working on one important problem. And yes, whether we might be able to get UBI without changing these things, we might need to change these things, but we got to have a vision of where our society needs to go. And our societies are a long way from where they should be right now in so many ways. We've got to keep a vision on that. Okay, Benedict.
Don't democratization and UBI go hand in hand to some extent? UBI could promote participation and promote democracy in a given society.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It helps with democratization, and democratization, a genuine democratization, I think, helps with redistributive policies. We have so much democracy, the type of democracy we have in most countries, allows for so much power to the elites that they block a lot of things. And then we get, we get a lot of manipulation of people also with things like nationalism and this proto-fascism that's sweeping around the world right now. But back to the book. Okay, Marvin.
Yes.
Am I saying that right? I want to say it because in America we call it Marvin. And I want to say it as German as I can. Marvin.
That's about as German as it gets.
Okay.
No worries.
I also don't really care.
Yeah.
It's all right, however you want to.
Well, I'm a visitor here. I like
Long
the.
A, silent R, that's it.
Yeah.
I would like to start at the beginning of the argument, and which is how we call it, the mutual advantage hypothesis.
Mhm.
And I feel like if we assume that there was like this natural prehistoric state,
Mhm.
then if we look back, there must have been a reason why societies develop.
Mhm.
And that reason must have been that somehow the group of people decided, hey, we are better off if we organize us in one way or another. And so there's like this historic continuum which would hint at that at some point in time we were better off in a society, organized as a society than in this natural state, whatever that was. And so for me, if I analyze this, this would suggest that maybe rather if we would also say we have enough empirical evidence to say that today we are worse off, or some members of society are worse off than this presumed natural state, that this would hint at that we rather went wrong somewhere along the way, or some imbalances occurred. And I feel like that going from there, this makes a very nice argument for the UBI, because it's about redistribution of something that we somehow failed to incorporate on how we distribute the wealth that we have as work. And I also feel like that for the UBI specifically, we don't really need an argument, that we don't really need to like say that this argument is wrong, because I think the UBI you can justify very nicely with the social justice argument.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if this string of thought was clear.
Well, if you can, well, I'm not saying the social justice argument isn't a good argument. But if you constantly concede this argument to the other side, you're conceding something that works in their favor that is in fact false. You're arguing, if we at least falsify that, you're making your side stronger. But about the other part, but one thing is that I should point out, there's one thing that at least most philosophers have figured out from anthropology, is that the state of nature is a misnomer. Hobbes and Rousseau and most philosophers at that time had this belief that human beings had their natural animalistic state. And then they came along and got civilized and reached this higher state. There is no truth in that whatsoever. There is no natural state of human beings. Perhaps there's a natural state of ants, or a natural state of animal, a natural state of chimpanzees, and they can be domesticated. But humans know, because what humans do is they think about, how do I want to live? And they make ways of living. And humans all around the world, for as long as there have been humans, have been making different norms and ethics and folkways and rules to live by, and then thinking out different ways. There is no natural state. So the state doesn't have to be justified against the unnatural, so the unnatural state doesn't have to be justified against the stateless natural state, as Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau thought. But the state has to be justified against the alternatives, and statelessness is an alternative. A common property right regime is one of the alternatives to a private property regime, as a state property regime is a third alternative. And this is one area where I think Rawls gets it right. As I said, I criticize Rawls a lot, but not in this book, because what Rawls does is he doesn't assume any state is natural. What he says is, what we have to do to justify the state, whatever society we have, is to look at all possible society arrangements and make sure that this one is as good as possible for the least advantaged member. And that's really the kind of thing we're doing in this book. And it's like, we not only have we not done that in the Rawlsian sense of looking at all the other societies, but we haven't even done it in the basic Hobbesian sense of looking how people could live if they lived outside of anybody's authority, as we know people have lived from anthropology. We know people have lived without property rights to properties, imposing property rights on them, and then benefit.
Britain was left in his hand.
Oh, okay, Dritan, go ahead.
Okay, so I just heard you mention that UBI is a certain way, and you didn't criticize Rawls on this point. And if in a parasitic society some people take advantage of the people who are worse off, then is there any other way other than UBI that could solve such an issue? For instance, one of the things that popped in my mind as you were talking was the negative income taxation, which targets the people who live below a certain level of income. And that could be morally justifiable by the argument that why would a millionaire need universal basic income?
Yeah. Okay, well, that issue, well, negative income tax, if it works well, does the same thing that basic income does, if it works properly. So yeah, in that sense, if they both work just exactly as they're supposed to work, for the poor, and whatever things go wrong with them are gonna be not the kind of things that are gonna make it harder for the lower class. Then yes, negative income tax works as well. Now, if your question is broader about other social policies, such as a guaranteed job or better categorical redistribution of property, those sorts of policies, the kind of argument in this book, you could say, yeah, those sorts of policies will satisfy most of the things we talk about in this book. The only one that I find those really lacking on is the freedom issue, which I didn't mention in the presentation. It's a long book, can't present the whole thing in 45 minutes. But you read the freedom part of the book and you'll see that. But negative income tax and basic income do. If they work right. But my issues with basic income is that my issue with negative income tax is that it is more likely to fail in crucial moments than basic income in a way that will harm the least advantaged. And what you said about why give it to the rich, well, you're not really giving it to the rich, because what you're doing is you're giving the rich a basic income, and then you're taxing the rich. So you give them $20,000 in basic income, and you tax them $20,000 out of their income, and they're really not benefiting from that situation. The rich do not get a financial benefit from basic income. You pay them, they pay it back. The two cancel each other out. And what you really have to look at in basic income is the net redistributive effect. Once you take somebody's taxes and subtract their basic income, that finds how much they pay or how much they get paid on the net. That's what's important about basic income. The two can, if they both work perfectly, the two achieve the same thing. So there's no cost savings with negative income tax. But with negative income tax, there are times when it'll fail. So imagine, okay, negative income tax is, if your income is below a certain amount, we're gonna make that up. But if your family income is below that certain amount, we are, then you'll be paying and nobody's actually gonna receive the money. The problem is, one of the problems is that people's income changes quickly, surprisingly, and then the authority that's supposed to get your negative income tax has to know that. You lose your job, they've got to know that the next day, or you're out of luck, or something like that. So imagine that you are a caregiver for 3 children, and you have a spouse that makes lots and lots of money. So you are not receiving your negative income tax because you're in this household with all these people. But then one day you find out that your spouse is abusing your children. So you and your children flee to a battered woman's shelter. And then you're not getting a negative income tax because officially you're married to this guy. So then you've got to call somebody. Last thing you want to do when you've just fled your abusive husband and you go to a shelter is to have to call somebody and be evaluated to say, oh, did you really leave your husband? Is this really the issue? So that's why, and that can cause problems. Sometimes that person on the phone might not be so sympathetic. Basic income is automatic. It's going into your account separately from his account.